The autumn wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a banshee, rattling the shutters of Jeremiah Jed McKenna's isolated ranch house. It was near midnight on October 15, 1888, and the old cowboy was settling into his favorite chair with a cup of coffee and his worn Bible when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the night air. Jed set down his coffee and reached for the Spencer rifle that never left his side. At 62 years old, he had survived the Civil War, Indian raids, and countless range wars. But something about those knocks in the dead of night sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the Wyoming cold. "Who's there?" he called out, his weathered hand steady on the rifle's stock. "Please, mister," came a young voice, barely audible over the wind. "We need help. We've been walking for days, and we don't have anywhere else to go." Jed approached the door cautiously. Visitors were rare at his remote ranch, especially children in the middle of the night. He had chosen this isolated location specifically to avoid the complications that came with neighbors and their problems, but something in that young voice touched a part of his heart he thought had died long ago. When he opened the door, Jed was confronted by a sight that nearly brought him to his knees. 4 children stood on his porch, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 15 years old. They were thin, exhausted, and their clothes were little more than rags. Their dark skin and the terror in their eyes told a story that Jed had hoped was becoming history. "Sweet Jesus," Jed whispered, immediately stepping aside. "Get in here, all of you. You'll freeze to death out there." The children filed in silently, their bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The oldest, a girl with eyes that seemed far too mature for her face, stood protectively in front of the younger ones. She clutched something against her chest with white-knuckled determination. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion written across her features. "I'm Ruth, and these are my brothers and sister. This is Samuel, he's 13. That's Grace, she's 10, and little Moses there is 7. Jed studied the children's faces, seeing the unmistakable family resemblance in their strong cheekbones and determined expressions. More importantly, he saw the haunted look of people who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. "Where did you come from?" Jed asked gently, moving to stoke the fire and add more wood. The children gathered around the warmth like moths to a flame. Ruth glanced at her siblings before answering. "We escaped from a place about 50 miles south of here. A place where they kept people like us to work without pay, without hope of ever leaving." Jed's blood ran cold. He had heard whispers of such places, hidden operations that continued the practice of slavery even though the war had supposedly ended it. But to see living proof standing in his kitchen was something else entirely. "Ruth, what are you holding there?" Jed asked, noticing how she continued to clutch the object to her chest. Ruth hesitated for a moment, then slowly revealed what she had been protecting. It was a piece of cloth, torn and stained, with markings that looked like they had been drawn in charcoal and blood. As Jed examined it more closely, he realized it was a crude map. "Our pa drew this before they killed him," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was trying to help other families escape, but the overseers caught him before he died. He told me to memorize this map and to find someone who could help us free the others." Jed accepted the map with trembling hands. The markings showed a rough layout of buildings, guard positions, and what appeared to be multiple compounds connected by trails through rough country. At the bottom, written in a shaking hand, were the words 43 souls still trapped. "God forgive us all. How many people are still being held?" Jed asked. Though he dreaded the answer, Samuel stepped forward, his young face set with determination. That reminded Jed of soldiers he'd known during the war. At least 40, maybe more. Families mostly, with children younger than Moses. They're kept in different camps, moved around so nobody can find them all at once. Grace, the 10-year-old, spoke up for the first time. "The bad men said they were going to sell us down south, to places where nobody would ever look for us. Papa heard them talking about it, and that's when he started planning our escape." Jed felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the same rage that had driven him through battles at Gettysburg and Antietam. But this was different. This wasn't warfare between armies. This was pure evil preying on the innocent. And it was happening right here in the territory he called home. "Ruth," he said carefully, Why did you bring this to me? How did you even know where to find me?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Papa said if anything happened to him, we should find Jeremiah McKenna. He said you were a man who fought for what was right, and you wouldn't turn your back on people who needed help." Jed was stunned. He hadn't spoken to another soul about his past in years, yet somehow this man he'd never met had known exactly who he was and where to find him. "What was your father's name?" Jed asked. Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Ezra Washington. He said he served under you in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry during the war." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Ezra Washington had been one of the bravest men he'd ever known. A former slave who had enlisted the moment he was allowed to fight. Jed had been a sergeant in one of the first African American regiments, and Ezra had saved his life during the siege of Charleston. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible Western stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Jed sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of recognition and responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Ezra Washington was dead, murdered while trying to save his people from a slavery that was supposed to have ended with the war, and now his children stood in Jed's kitchen, trusting him to finish what their father had started. "Ruth," Jed said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "your father was one of the finest men I ever knew. He saved my life more than once during the war. I owe him a debt I can never repay." Ruth's eyes brightened with hope. "Does that mean you'll help us?" Jed looked at the four faces watching him, seeing not just Ezra's children, but the faces of 43 other souls still trapped in conditions that belonged in the darkest chapters of American history. He had spent 23 years trying to forget the war and the responsibilities that came with fighting for justice. But some debts could never be escaped. "It means," Jed said, studying the crude map one more time, "that we're going to honor your father's memory by finishing what he started. We're going to free every single person marked on this map, no matter what it costs." Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to follow this epic Western adventure and discover the horrors hidden in the secret slave camps. As the wind continued to howl outside, Jeremiah McKenna began planning the most dangerous mission of his life, knowing that 43 innocent lives hung in the balance, and that failure would dishonor the memory of the bravest man he'd ever known. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Wyoming plains as Jed studied Ezra's map. By the light of his kitchen window, the four children had finally fallen asleep near the fireplace, exhausted by their ordeal, but Jed had spent the night analyzing every mark and notation on the torn cloth. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The map didn't show just one illegal operation, but an entire network of hidden camps scattered across 100 square miles of remote territory. Each location was marked with numbers that Jed realized corresponded to the number of people held captive there. Ruth stirred from her sleep and padded over to where Jed sat hunched over the map. "Morning, Mr. McKenna," she said quietly, careful not to wake her siblings. "Morning, Ruth." "Call me Jed," he replied, looking up at the girl who carried herself with the dignity of someone far older than her 15 years. "Tell me about these numbers." "Your father marked here." Ruth studied the map, pointing to various locations. "Papa figured out the pattern. The camp where we were held had about 15 people. But see this mark here?" She indicated a spot deep in the Badlands. "That's where they keep the families with the youngest children. Papa counted at least 20 people there, including babies." Jed felt his jaw clench. "And this one," he pointed to the largest marking on the map, "that's the main camp," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's where they take people who try to escape or who cause trouble. Papa said there were at least 30 people there, and most of them were in bad shape from the punishments." Samuel woke up and joined their conversation, his young face serious beyond his 13 years. "Mr. Jed, Ruth didn't tell you the worst part. The men running these camps aren't just keeping people as slaves. They're selling them to buyers who come through every few months." Jed looked up sharply. "Selling them where?" Samuel glanced at Ruth, who nodded for him to continue. "South, mostly. To plantations in places where they pretend the war never ended. But also west, to mining camps and railroad construction sites where nobody asks questions about where the workers come from." The full scope of the operation began to dawn on Jed. This wasn't just a local crime, it was part of a broader network that stretched across multiple territories, exploiting the chaos and lawlessness of the post-war frontier to continue practices that should have died with the Confederacy. Ruth pulled out a small piece of paper she had kept hidden in her shoe. Papa wrote down some names before he died. These are the men in charge of the operation. Jed examined the list, recognizing several names that made his heart sink. The operation was being run by Colonel Marcus Thornfield, a former Confederate officer who had supposedly fled to Mexico after the war. But according to Ezra's notes, Thornfield had returned under an assumed name and was using his military experience to organize the slave camps with military precision. Even worse, the list included the names of several local officials who were being paid to look the other way. Sheriff Garrett from the county seat was receiving monthly payments, as was Judge Crawford, who ensured that any captured escapees were returned to their employers, rather than being freed. How did your father learn all this? Jed asked, amazed at the detail in the intelligence Ezra had gathered. Grace, now awake and listening intently, answered for Ruth. Papa could read and write real good, and he was friendly with everyone. The bad men thought he was just a simple worker, so they talked freely around him. He heard them making plans and wrote everything down. Ruth nodded. Papa also made friends with guards who weren't as mean as the others. Some of them felt bad about what was happening, and they told him things they shouldn't have. Little Moses, the 7-year-old, climbed onto Jed's lap and looked up at him with eyes that had seen far too much. Are you really going to help the other families? He asked in a small voice. Jed wrapped his arms around the boy, feeling a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his own son died in the war. Yes, Moses, I'm going to help them. But first, I need to understand exactly what we're up against. Jed spent the next hour questioning the children about every detail they could remember. The camps were heavily guarded, with armed men on horseback patrolling the perimeters. The prisoners were kept in crude barracks that were locked at night, and anyone caught trying to escape faced brutal punishment. But there were weaknesses in the system. The guards changed shifts predictably, and most of them drank heavily during their off hours. The camps were located in remote areas where the sound of gunfire wouldn't attract attention. But that same isolation meant that reinforcements would be slow to arrive if the camps came under attack. Most importantly, Ezra had identified several prisoners who were former soldiers, men who could fight if given weapons and the chance to do so. Ruth, Jed said finally, I need you to understand something. What you're asking me to do will be extremely dangerous. If we fail, all of us could end up dead or worse. Are you sure this is what your father would want? Ruth looked at her siblings, then back at Jed. Mr. Jed, my father died believing that no person should ever own another person. He told us that freedom isn't something you ask for. It's something you fight for. If we don't try to save those people, then Papa died for nothing. Samuel stood up straighter. We want to help, sir. We know the camps, we know the guards, and we know how to move through that country without being seen. Jed studied the 4 young faces looking at him with such trust and determination. They had already risked everything to bring him this information. How could he ask them to risk more? Don't miss the next chapter of this epic Western adventure. Subscribe to our channel to follow this dangerous mission and discover whether Jed and the children can free the captives before Thornfield's network destroys the evidence and moves the prisoners beyond reach. But looking at Ezra's map and thinking about the 43 souls still trapped in those hidden camps, Jed knew there was really no choice at all. Some fights chose you, whether you wanted them or not. As he began planning the rescue operation, Jed silently promised his old friend, Ezra, that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The children of a hero deserved to see justice done, and the innocent deserved to taste freedom. The war might have ended 23 years ago, but for Jeremiah McKenna, the fight for human dignity was about to begin all over again. 3 days of careful planning had led to this moment. Jed and the 4 siblings crouched behind a rocky outcrop overlooking the main slave camp. In Devil's Canyon, watching the guards patrol patterns with the patience of seasoned hunters, the torn map had proven accurate in every detail, guiding them through treacherous badlands to this hidden valley, where Colonel Thornfield had established his most secure operation. Through his field glasses, Jed could see the wooden barracks where 30 people were held prisoner, including families with children as young as Moses. The sight of armed guards casually walking past buildings that housed human misery made his trigger finger itch with barely restrained fury. Ruth lay beside him, studying the camp layout with the tactical awareness her father had taught her. "The guards change shifts in 20 minutes, she whispered. "That's when Papa said there." Most distracted, Samuel and Grace had positioned themselves at opposite ends of the canyon, each carrying signal mirrors to coordinate the attack. Little Moses, despite his protests, had been left at their base camp with strict instructions to ride for help. If they didn't return by dawn, Jed checked his weapons one final time. His Spencer rifle was loaded and ready, with extra cartridges. In easy reach, 2 Colt revolvers hung from his gun belt, weapons he had carried through countless battles, but had hoped never to use again. But some evils demanded a response in the only language they understood. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Jed would create a diversionary attack on the main guard post while Ruth slipped into the camp to free the prisoners and arm any former soldiers among them. Samuel and Grace would use their mirrors to signal when guards approached from there, assign directions, giving the rescue party crucial intelligence about enemy movements. Everything depended on speed and surprise. If Thornfield's men managed to organize a coordinated defense, the rescue would turn into a massacre with innocent families caught in the crossfire. As the guard shift change began, Jed squeezed Ruth's shoulder. "Remember what I taught you. Get in, free as many as you can, and get them to the horses. Don't try to be a hero." Ruth nodded grimly. "Papa always said that living free for one day was better than being a slave for a lifetime. Whatever happens, those people are going to taste freedom tonight." Jed moved into position behind the guard post, waiting for Ruth's signal. Through the evening air, he could hear voices from inside the prisoner barracks, adults trying to comfort frightened children with lullabies and whispered prayers. The sound strengthened his resolve and reminded him of what they were fighting for. The signal came as a flash of reflected moonlight from Ruth's position. Jed took a deep breath, said a prayer for the souls of everyone depending on him, and opened fire on the guard post. His first shot took down the sentry in the watchtower, while his second and third shots shattered the windows of the building where the off-duty guards were drinking. Shouts of alarm filled the night air as confused men stumbled out of buildings. Trying to locate the source of the attack, Ruth moved like a ghost through the shadows, her small size and dark clothing making her nearly invisible as she approached the first barracks. The prisoners inside had heard the gunfire and were pressed against the walls, uncertain whether this represented salvation or simply another form of danger. "It's Ruth Washington," she called softly through the locked door, "Ezra's daughter. We've come to take you home." The response was immediate. Men's voices began organizing the evacuation, while women gathered children and what few possessions they had managed to keep. Ruth used tools Jed had given her to break the locks, and within minutes the first group of liberated prisoners was moving toward the canyon exit. But the escape didn't go unnoticed. Colonel Thornfield himself appeared from the main house, shouting orders to his men and directing them to surround the barracks area. The diversionary attack had worked too well, drawing attention to exactly where Ruth was operating. Samuel's mirror flashed a warning from his position, but it was too late. Armed guards were already moving to cut off the prisoner's escape route. Ruth found herself trapped between the barracks and a group of 6 armed men, who had orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave. That's when the former soldiers among the prisoners revealed themselves. Led by a grizzled veteran named Thomas Freeman, they formed a defensive line around the escaping families, using improvised weapons and captured rifles to hold off Thornfield's men. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Jed's covering fire from the ridge kept the main body of guards pinned down, while Freeman's men fought a fighting retreat toward the canyon mouth. Ruth helped guide the civilians through the darkness, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable in avoiding the worst of the gunfire. The turning point came when Grace's mirror signaled that reinforcements were approaching from the south. Rather than wait to be surrounded, Jed made the decision to end the battle decisively. Using skills learned in a dozen Civil War engagements, he moved through the camp systematically, eliminating guards and destroying their communication systems. When he reached the main house where Colonel Thornfield had taken cover, Jed found himself face to face with the man responsible for so much suffering. Thornfield was everything Jed had expected: arrogant, unrepentant, and convinced that his cause justified any atrocity. "The war's over, Thornfield," Jed called out. "Surrender and you'll live to face trial." Thornfield's response was to fire wildly. Through the window, his shots going wide in panic. "You can't stop this, McKenna. There are camps like this all over the territory. Kill me and 10 more will take my place." "Maybe so," Jed replied, his voice cold as winter steel. "But you won't be around to see it." The final confrontation was over in seconds. Thornfield's desperation made him sloppy, while Jed's experience and righteous anger made him deadly. When the smoke cleared, the architect of the slave network lay dead, and 32 human beings were breathing free air for the first time in years. Subscribe now to our channel for more epic Western stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. The journey back to safety took 3 days, with the liberated prisoners traveling in groups toward towns where federal marshals could ensure their protection. Many of them had families in other states who had been searching for them since they disappeared. Ruth, Samuel, Grace, and Moses found new homes with families who welcomed them as heroes rather than refugees. But they maintained close contact with Jed, who had become the father figure their own father had wanted them to find. Jed McKenna never returned to his isolated existence. Instead, he worked with federal authorities to track down and eliminate the remaining camps in Thornfield's network. His testimony helped convict dozens of officials who had participated in the conspiracy, while his actions inspired others to take up the fight against post-war slavery. The torn map that had started their adventure was preserved as evidence in the trials that followed, but more importantly, it became a symbol of how ordinary people could resist extraordinary evil when they found the courage to act. Ezra Washington's sacrifice was honored not just with the freedom of his children, but with the liberation of every soul trapped by men who refused to accept that the war had truly ended. His children grew up free, educated, and determined to ensure that no future generation would face the horrors they had survived. This Western story reminds us that the fight for human dignity never truly ends, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies, but by families willing to risk everything for freedom and justice.